Hello, welcome to the Historical Society of the Phoenixville area's virtual museum tour. My name is Jack Ertell. Today we'll take a look at the Historical Society's collection of Etruscan Majolica pottery. Phoenixville is probably most famous for its iron and steel history. However, it had a thriving pottery industry here in the 1880s. And the primary company, of course, was Griffin, Smith, and Hill. We're standing in the Clegg room of the Historical Society's museum. The room features over 120 pieces of pottery that are part of our collection of over 300 pieces of Etruscan Majolica pottery. Well, what was Etruscan Majolica pottery? It was a style of pottery produced in the late 19th century. It started in England in the 1850s, quickly became very popular throughout Europe and the United States. In the 1880s, an American company here in Phoenixville, known as Griffin, Smith, and Hill, was named after four people, the Griffin brothers, Harry and George, David Smith and William Hill. And the four of them produced beautiful, lustrous, brightly colored, decorative pottery for more than 10 years. We have some great examples here in our museum. They are typical of the Victorian pottery of that era. Bright, colorful, highly decorative, featuring images of nature. When we look at the collection that Phoenixville produced, we can find sunflowers, animals of different types, birds, berries, plants, trees. They were produced in a very skillful manner, and in fact the Phoenixville company had a very great reputation for success. A lot of the pieces they produced are most famous for the colors that they used, and one of the most famous colors that helps identify the company is a pinkish purple color that was called orchid pink. Here's an example of that color. This is a cup produced in the 1880s, and if you look at this pinkish purple color in the inside of it, it is the classic example of one of the bright, vivid colors of Phoenix pottery. This is a pottery done in a pattern that was extremely popular, was called the coral and seaweed pattern. And you can see the configuration on it of seaweed shoots and coral and seashells, etc. This is a very interesting piece. We love to show this to the young students that come in for tours of our museum. This is called a mustache cup. In the 19th century, gentlemen had mustaches significantly larger than mine, and here's a good example. You look at the flowing mustache of this gentleman. We don't know who he is, but it's a great example. And the mustache cups, they were produced in order to protect a gentleman's mustache, because they used heavy cream in their tea and coffee, and you didn't want that getting on the bottom of your mustache. And so you had a cup that would have a bar across from it. And this is a mustache cup. There's only one thing wrong with it. If you are left-handed, you can't use it because it is designed for a right-handed person. And a lot of the students that come in find it quite interesting. Well, we have a great array of items here in the Historical Society that show the success of the company that was here in the 1880s, in particular when they manufactured this kind of pottery. They had a very large complex. They had a factory building about a block away from here in the lower part of the 100 block of Church Street. And they had three kilns that they had constructed that show how they would bake the pottery, actually bake it a couple times. They'd bake it, paint it, glaze it, and then bake it again so that it had the bright, lustrous shine. They built a couple very huge kilns. These are called bottle kilns, if you look at the shape of them. And if you want a real sense of how large these were, these little vertical figures down at the bottom are the workers. So you can get a real sense of how high these were. Most of the pottery was manufactured by molds. Plates would be put in formed in molds, and they would be stacked up in the kilns and then baked. But some of the other items were made by not only baking, but had to be made on a pottery wheel. And fortunately, in our collection that's been given to us through the years, we have some very interesting photographs of some of the potters at work. Here's an example of one, and you can see him working on a pottery wheel. And then here is another example of a worker from that time. The company employed over 40 workers at its peak. Many of them were women and children. People were paid piecework. In other words, they were paid by what they were able to produce during the day. Wages weren't very good. The children and the young girls were paid less than $1 a day. And in fact, a lot of the painting was actually done by teenage girls, and a lot of the yard work was done by young boys. This is a good example. This is an 1880s photograph of the male workers of the company. You have the Griffin brothers and Mr. Smith and Mr. Hill in the center, but I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom row, or the front row in this photograph. It consists of all young boys, roughly between the ages of 9 and 12. It was common in that era, of course, of child labor, when children would go to elementary school for 3 or 4 years to learn how to read and write. And particularly if they came from a poor family, they'd drop out of school so that they could help earn some wages for their family, to help support their family. And these young boys often did a lot of the grunt work in what was called the clay yard. They were called clay boys. A lot of the painting was done by young women. And we have a great photo in our collection that shows some of the young teenage girls who were painters. They really weren't paid very much. We have a record of an interview from someone in the 1880s who said they were paid 35 cents a day. So it isn't very much money, but in the 1880s, the average adult worker got about $1 a day. So you can get a sense of what that was. Well, we have a very, very broad collection of items here, and we often get asked, how do we know when a piece of pottery is actually Phoenixville-made Etruscan pottery? The best way to do it, of course, is if there's a potter's mark on the piece. A lot of their pieces did not have a potter's mark, and the kind of colors, which I mentioned before, the orchid pink is a good example because it was pretty much exclusive of the company. However, a lot of the pieces have a pottery mark that looks very much like this sketch. And if you look at it very carefully, it has a very stylized GSH for Griffin, Smith, and Hill in the center. And then surrounding it, it says Etruscan Majolica. This was the second pottery mark that they used during their time of production. If I hold up this bowl, and if you look very carefully, you can see, I'm going to turn it around so you can see Etruscan Majolica surrounded by the Griffin, Smith, and Hill mark. The company was very, very successful. They sold their products to retailers all over the United States. But we often get asked, well, what happened to the company? Because there's no evidence of them existing. Two things. First of all, Majolica pottery was a style that went in and out of fashion. It became fashionable in the 1850s, faded after 1900. On top of the declining interest in this kind of style, in the early 1890s, the factory, just down the street from the Historical Society, had a massive fire that destroyed much of their equipment, much of their building. The expense of rebuilding was greater than the financial ability of the company, and they basically closed their doors. Someone else came along a couple of years later, reopened it under another name, but was never as successful. Shortly after 1900, the land was sold, and the pottery kilns were torn down, and so there's no physical evidence left in town. But the Griffin, Smith, and Hill company and the products they produced is a great part of the historical legacy of Phoenixville, and we're very pleased to have the ability to display many, many pieces of the types that they manufactured in the 1880s. We hope you've enjoyed this short virtual tour of the Historical Society of the Phoenixville area's Etruscan Majolica collection. We ask you to please visit our museum at 204 Church Street when we reopen, and you can learn more about Majolica and other aspects of Phoenixville's history. You can also learn a lot about Phoenixville's history by going to our website. Our web address is www.hspa-pa.org. Let me repeat that. It's www.hspa-pa.org. Thanks for joining us.